Hey everyone, Andy here. I just want to put in a quick plug for the new channel Eyes On. Previously we fell under Team House and we shared subscribers, and what we're doing here is branching off, still within the Team House franchise. But it is important that we build up steam with our own subscription base. So please, cost you nothing, click on the subscribe button. Thank you. Hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Eyes On. I'm Andy Milburn.
I'm Jason Lyons.
I'm Dimitri Kontakos.
And today we are thrilled to have a guest, Doug Livermore, who's an old friend, a former SF dude, Army SF dude, but otherwise a good guy. He was in 310, did a couple of tours in Afghanistan, ended up buried in special activities. And that kind of set the course for the rest of his career because he is known in the irregular warfare community as being he'll challenge me on this, but as an expert, frankly. So he's right now he's senior vice president of a company called for solution engineering for a company called Cencor Group. And probably the best way to describe Cencor Group is that they support the intelligence community and special operations forces in a variety of ways. And before that, he spent 3 years as a director of sensitive activities, irregular warfare, in the office of the Department of the Navy. And before that, he was in the office of ASD SOLIC, which is Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict. And before that, worked for the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security with a portfolio focused on irregular warfare. And his publications are many and varied. If you Google him, you'll find out. And he works also as a volunteer for evacuation efforts for foreign interpreters out of Afghanistan, for No One Left Behind. And if we have some time at the end, I'd love to ask him to talk about that. Doug, welcome. What do you want to talk about today? What's going on in Ukraine?
Hey, thanks. Thanks so much, Andy. And the only thing I'll push back on that, we have been friends a long time, but I would agree that anyone who claims to be an expert on irregular warfare is lying to you, because as I think we're going to get into a little bit here this morning, that space is constantly evolving, particularly as we see around Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and there's always something more to learn, something new, something to adapt to. And I think to that end, when we start talking about what's going on in Ukraine today, we have to start at the micro level, internal to the country, and then what I'd like to do, of course, the conversation is move a little bit more outwardly. So to start off with what's going on right now on the ground, as you mentioned, through my nonprofit experience, I've managed to maintain some pretty close ties within Afghanistan, kind of similar to I'm sure that you have with your prior experiences. I'm also the vice president for the Special Operations Association of America, and one of the many efforts that we have undergoing is support to the International Legion, the Ukrainian Special Operations Forces, and a few other entities. So we do get fairly decent on-the-ground reporting, which we in SOA then use to have in-depth and regular conversations with U.S. policymakers, legislators, and folks like that. So let's start on the on the Eastern Front, if you will, in Ukraine. I think you've probably seen some of the more recent reports. Even this morning, the Russians continue to make slow progress, seizing another key village in eastern Ukraine. This is part of the ongoing push where, frankly, it looks like the Kremlin's continuing to just exchange bodies for meters of ground gained, hoping to grind down the Ukrainians really probably before the end of the fall fighting season, and things kind of slow down a little bit for the winter. What we've seen on the ground in eastern Ukraine has been really just like a hybrid between World War I style trench warfare with the Ukrainians on the defense, and really like high-end, next-generation Ghost Fleet style high-tech war. You've seen all the integration of first-person drones, some of the more advanced, even like unmanned ground vehicles that the Ukrainians are starting to field. But that combined with what you just see are really, really horrific casualties, mostly on the part of the Russians. The British government released probably has, because of their access on the ground, has probably some of the best analysis on what's going on in eastern Ukraine, and what they're projecting is you see anywhere between like a 1-to-5 to a 1-to-8 casualty ratio between the Ukrainians and the Russians, which, prior to the last couple of weeks, I would say that the Russians absolutely can't sustain, and eventually they'll run out of steam. What we have unfortunately seen in really like the last 2 weeks, and again, I know you've been following this, but for the sake of your audience, the introduction of North Korean troops into the fight. Specifically, I know about 2 weeks ago, there were some of the first murmurings, some of the initial intelligence reports that were being pointed to by the Ukrainians and the South Koreans, interestingly enough, indicating that in honoring the recently ratified security cooperation agreement between the Russian Federation and North Korea was going to start contributing troops on top of what it was already doing with missiles and other systems, some of like the short to medium range ballistic missiles that the North Koreans have been providing, in addition to the ungodly amount of artillery ammunition that the North Koreans were already providing to Russia. So anyway, over the last 2 weeks, there's been kind of the usual hemming and hawing where neither NATO nor the U.S. or any of our other partners and allies were willing to confirm presence of North Korean troops on the battlefield. But just this morning, NATO headquarters confirmed that there are, in fact, North Korean troops inside Ukraine fighting alongside the Russians. So I only offer that when we start talking about the Eastern Front, in particular in Ukraine, and some of the strategic overview. Because as I and you have told many people, we can't confuse Russia of today with the Soviet Union of yesteryear. Everyone points back to the fact that the Soviet Union basically steamrollered over Germany, and they're willing to endure endless casualties, and you can't break the Russian will on casualties alone. I would point out that Russia is not that country. Its population is significantly smaller than that of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union rolled over Nazi Germany, it did so with a lot of Ukrainians in its ranks as part of the Soviet Union. So anyway, what the introduction of North Korean troops provides to Vladimir Putin is really a lot of relief on those casualty rates that we were just talking about. Be it 1-to-5 or 1-to-8 in favor of the Ukrainians. Putin now gets a little bit more breathing room if he can start sacrificing North Korean soldiers instead of Russian soldiers. Most folks forget that one of the major contributing factors to the collapse of the Soviet Union was the Mothers Movement that grew up around the Soviet casualties, and particularly the Russian casualties that were suffered in Afghanistan. That was only around 15,000 total casualties over the 10 years of the Soviet Union's involvement there. So I do think that depending upon the size of the North Korean contribution to the war, and the progress or lack of progress that the Russians make here in the next couple months before winter really sets in, and offensive operations in eastern Ukraine grind to a halt, will have a huge influence on the outcome of the fight, at least in eastern Ukraine, and probably more broadly strategically. I mean, right now the Russians are holding roughly 18% of the overall Ukrainian territory, which is fairly insignificant, but it is starting to get up towards what Putin's declared objectives were of occupying all of Luhansk and Donetsk. Kherson, the rest of Kherson Oblast is probably outside the reach of any Russian offensive, particularly given the presence of the Dnipro River between the two banks. But yeah, so if Putin can clear the rest of Donetsk, Luhansk, he's still holding Crimea, and I suspect that there'll just be a decision not to pursue the rest of Kherson Oblast. Putin could theoretically declare victory if he clears those three, if he holds the three complete oblasts and at least half of Kherson. So, I think, and again, it's really unknown right now. I think the latest estimate I saw from the Ukrainians and the South Koreans was they think that North Korea has committed some 11,000 to 12,000 troops to Russia to use on the front lines. And I know we said we were going to start micro and work macro, but I will say my perspective is that the North Koreans can probably contribute far more troops than that. For one, most of their troops are starving to death due to poor crop production and conditions on the ground in North Korea. And frankly, despite all of the bluster from the North Koreans, I don't think there's a world in which they actually think that the United States and South Koreans are going to come across the border, across the demarcation line, and try to invade North Korea. So with the North Koreans having nuclear weapons as kind of their ultimate fallback, and frankly, aside from internal security, not a whole lot of requirements for the massive army they've built, my fear will be that they will just continue to pump tens of thousands of more troops into the fight in Ukraine. So, I do think the next several months or the next 2 months will be very, very telling. I do know that the Ukrainians are pretty severely outmanned, just in pure numbers on the Eastern Front in Ukraine. And as the Russians continue to make that creeping advance, particularly if they can start now trading, say, like North Korean bodies instead of Russian bodies for that terrain, that will certainly give them some advantages. So I'm going to pause there on the Eastern Front.
So can I jump in very quickly there? So essentially, and what you just said is, I think it's an important point that we're not being Pollyanna-ish, but there is no sign of a Ukrainian collapse. And it is clear that the Ukrainians, they just gave up Vukovar, which essentially was, is a ruined settlement. But they're trading, as you point out, terrain for casualties. And just to give everyone a scale of Russian casualties, the British Ministry of Defense estimates the Russians are losing 1,000 a day. Okay, that's so all casualties killed and wounded, 1,000 guys a day. And that is not unusual when you look back throughout the war in Donbass. That's kind of been the norm, and in fact, in the fighting for Bakhmut, it was even higher than that. That's an extraordinary amount. But even at that level, there's 12,000. The Storm Corps will last 2 weeks, and that's what the Ukrainians are predicting. Even if they do fight, even if they are good and they're not, and even if the Ukrainians, I'd like to see them use psychological warfare to a much greater extent than they are. But if the Ukrainians jump on board that and start messaging these guys as they're arriving at the front, perhaps with, North Koreans, former North Korean defectors sending these messages, I think that the talk about these additional numbers of Koreans may not be. It doesn't look as though they're going to be a strategic game changer, I guess, is what I'm saying. Do you think all of that is fair?
No, and Andy, that's a great point. I know there have already been reports of decently large numbers of North Koreans surrendering or defecting. I think you can probably mince words as to which one it actually was. But yeah, so there's already been that. I do think that in particular, if we were to see North Koreans more heavily employed on the front lines, as I said previously, there were some reports of them up, and we'll talk the Kursk counteroffensive and that here in a minute. But if you start seeing appreciable numbers of North Koreans directly engaged in assaults on Ukrainian positions, I do think you're going to see that number start to move up. And like you said, you raised that great point about the casualties. 1,000, at least recently, from what I've been seeing on the daily casualty counts for the Russians, is at least that's the bare minimum of 1,000 a day. You see fluctuations. Yeah. I know in this last week you've seen 1,400 plus on some days, and obviously some fluctuations based upon what's happening on the front. And again, obviously there's a fairly wide disparity in the numbers that get presented. Like the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense has one set of numbers. I think this morning when I looked, it was 687,000 total Russian, dead and wounded. I think that number is probably a little bit inflated, but even the United States, even the U.S. government, as of the Department of Defense, the last number we put out was a little north of 350,000, which again, at the end of the day, when the entire Russian army started off at, I think it was a little bit over 1 million, that's a catastrophic impact. So yeah, to your point, I do think one can be both, provide sober assessments, but also look at the grand strategic design and recognize that the Ukrainians do have a very good chance winning this thing. And frankly, if you look at where we were in March, April of 2022, when the Russians were at the gates of Kiev, and there was the major battles in and around the city, and the Russians ended up having to withdraw and defeat, and you know, fall back all the way back to Belarus and back into Russian territory. And the fact that we went from that to today, the Russians basically expending every ounce of their military might to hold on to 18% of Ukrainian territory. Like the threat of there is, I don't see a threat of a complete collapse of the front, and the Russians, like you hear from the Russian propagandists, that they're going to be back in Kyiv in a matter of weeks, and that's all very, very wishful thinking. And again, I'll just like close up that thought on your point about the North Korean contribution. Again, you're right. I don't see it as a game changer. I do see it as a bit of a desperate ploy by Putin that Kim is going along with to say, hey, I'll give you North Korean bodies so you can you can try to keep some level of popular support for the war, which is another important point. I think the latest polls that were conducted out of, I think it was the Moscow Times, about a month and a half ago, actually saw for the first time a very sizable, well, not quite a majority, but I think it was like at 49% of Russians that were saying that the special military operation, otherwise known to everyone else as the invasion of Ukraine, wasn't worth it, and that there should be a negotiated settlement to end the war. So you are seeing these massive casualties and all these expenditures, the absolute destruction of the Russian economy, starting to have a very significant impact on Russian popular support for the war. So if you're seeing like a 49% in a public forum or in a public poll, you can be sure that the actual the hidden thoughts and feelings that the Russian people are holding are probably significantly higher.
They're running low on munitions too. One thing that hasn't been hitting the news is the Ukraine's been hitting their ammunition storage depots, and so the ratio. I mean, you remember at its worst. You remember when the Ukrainians were waiting for from us for ammunition, and the ratio dropped to like 10-1, right? 10 Russian shells for every Ukrainian. Well, now that gap's closed to, I forget, but it's like 2-5 or something, or two Ukrainian. So there are things happening, I would argue, behind the scenes that don't make it as pessimistic as you might read in some of the papers.
Yeah, 100%. And yeah, I know at the worst we were looking at like 1 to 12 on the artillery exchanges. The Ukrainians did, and actually I wrote a piece about this a couple weeks ago now, but yeah, at the Irregular Warfare Initiative. But what the Ukrainians have really been really amazing in implementing has been a sustained unconventional warfare campaign against the Russians, and that's working by, with, and through, interestingly, both Ukrainian partisans in the occupied territories, so Donetsk, Luhansk, Crimea, the parts of Kherson that are still occupied. But really what's been fascinating has been the work done by the Ukrainian Special Operations Forces and intelligence services, Russian partisans inside Russia. And as you alluded to, there have been very, very significant. In fact, one of the numbers I'd seen just in the last couple of days was the sabotage and deep strike drones that the Ukrainian Special Operations Forces, intelligence services, and working with Russian partisans have undertaken had affected something like 12% of Russia's oil production, which at the end of the day, like John McCain said, Russia is a gas station run by gangsters. It's what the entire economy is based on. You look at like you were saying, the munition attacks. There's been a series of some of the larger munition depots inside Russia, inside the occupied territories that have been destroyed. And yeah, you're right. That rate of artillery exchange, which again, kind of like I was saying before, this war has seen an odd mix of like World War I style trench warfare, where artillery is most definitely king, with high tech like drones and whatnot. But we've really seen that rate come more into balance. And what's also been interesting in the last, I'd say, year, really, is the rate to which the Ukrainians have undertaken domestic production of artillery, drones, missiles. Because as we were saying, like the west of the country has largely been unaffected. There are still the occasional drone strikes and missile strikes in like Lviv and in some of the areas in Western Ukraine. but that's really provided a space in which the Ukrainians have undertaken a lot of their own production. A lot of European companies, I don't think any American defense firms have just yet, but I know like the Germans, Rheinmetall, and some other major European defense firms have actually like looked at, and some are planning on opening up facilities to co-produce munitions and armored vehicles and things like that inside Ukraine. So that development of an indigenous military industrial complex is going to be super, I think, beneficial. And as we see, unfortunately, I think as we see this war, or as we see this war, unfortunately, stretch on, will have a strategic impact in allowing the Ukrainians to really sustain the fight, regardless of international support, which may wane or strengthen depending on a number of factors.
Doug,
Go ahead.
very quickly though, I would argue, and maybe you have insights into this, but the Ukrainians are not good in the information warfare space. They were great at the beginning of the war, but now the narrative from, the Russian narrative that is being picked up here, you can hear very strongly in the United States, is that Ukraine cannot win the war. And it that to me, that seems like something that the Ukrainians need to focus more on. And we talked about psychological warfare. My personal experience is so dated now, but I can tell you during the year, the year or so that I was there was very little effort to get Russians to defect. The tactical psyops, which could have a huge effect, even strategically. I would argue. But are you saying that they're getting better at that, both from the strategic?
So it's fascinating. One could have, I think there is an important differentiation between what's happening at the strategic level and what's happening at the operational and tactical level. I think let's start big and let's start small and work big. So I'm sure you've seen a lot of the material that the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense has been putting out regarding, in particular, around their prisoner of war system and how well, you just have to watch videos that the Ministry of Defense puts out talking about how well these Russian prisoners are kept. They're fed well. They get all the medical support they need. They're allowed, as part of the PSYOPs campaign, they're also allowed to communicate with their families back home, which I think also has an effect in really showing common Russians the true nature of the war. My impression has been, particularly like what you saw in the Kursk counteroffensive now almost 3 months ago now, was that you did see a large number of Russians surrendering to Ukrainians, fully recognizing that they were going to be well cared for. And in many cases, better cared for than they were when they were in the service of the Kremlin. And then you compare that to what we've been seeing about summary executions and starvation and all the deprivations that are visited upon Ukrainian prisoners of war being held by the Russians. So my impression is at the tactical and operational level, the Ukrainians, I think they're getting better at that part. You just got to go on social media, and I know you've seen me share a lot of these, but like the videos from the tactical and operational level successes that the Ukrainians are having. They are considerable.
Check. I just want to add in a plug. Check Doug out. Yes, not in that sense deep, but on social media, his LinkedIn account. When Doug posts, he gets. We have audience envy, Doug. So please do plug us too. But yes, I haven't seen anyone else post what you are posting. So I just want to add, please continue. And for everyone else, if you want to know what's going on in Ukraine, follow Doug. We'll put in his information at the end.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah. So what I was, every time the Ukrainians trade a first-person drone, probably $1,000 or $2,000 worth of equipment, counting the munition for a Russian air defense system at $50 million or something like that. That is a good exchange rate for both the Ukrainians and, as I've argued frequently and loudly, also for those of us that are supporting Ukraine. At the end of the day, the Russians are a destabilizing force, and anything that can be done to both liberate Ukraine, but then also prevent the Russians from using that equipment elsewhere, I think is a win-win for everyone involved. But so then once you start looking, I do agree that the Ukrainians have certainly had some struggles at the strategic and geostrategic level when it comes to their messaging campaigns. I mean, I agree. Like you look at February of 2022, probably until mid 2023, the Ukrainian strategic impact of their influence ops was undeniable. You know, when President Zelensky said, I don't need a ride, I need more ammunition, and I think that was like late February of 2022. Like that was the "give me liberty or give me death" moment that went all around the world multiple times. And there was obviously that very considerable support, I'd say, in the first year and a half. And the Ukrainians were very good about, and I think it also helped from the battlefield successes. I mean, you saw kind of like the little engine that could, the underdog Ukrainians, like I was saying earlier, pushing the Russians back out of all the territory that they had conquered. I think probably the turning point was the struggles and the challenges, and I'd say the ultimate failure of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the summer of 2023. And we could do a whole nother podcast on the reasons why that happened. I think there's a ton of delay in getting the equipment that the Ukrainians needed, a ton of delay in training them on it. I mean, unfortunately, I was still in the government at the time, so I was reading the reports, like watching the Russian defensive belts get built, and fully knowing that the Ukrainians are going to have to fight their way through that, and then ultimately they were unsuccessful. I do think once that momentum was lost, because if you remember correctly, in summer of 2023, there was the first kind of I'll call it the stutter step, where everyone was looking at the south, and then the Ukrainians went north into Kharkiv and liberated like all of Kharkiv, pushed the Russians back, liberated hundreds of square miles of terrain, and that was a huge win. But in the south, they did not. And then the line stabilized, I'd say, late 2023 into early 2024. And then what the result of that is I think it was probably a combination of the Ukrainians, I think, lacking some of the big good news stories like that, like the liberation of territories in late 22 and early 23, as well as kind of, well, two things at the global level. There was, I think, growing fatigue with donor support from donor countries, which we've actually seen this very interesting bifurcation in there, where countries like in Europe on the eastern flank, the Polands, the Baltic states, are actually like upping their contributions to Ukraine. But then other countries like the United States, I mean, we were, like you were alluding to earlier, we went through that whole nightmare of trying to get the additional aid released in just earlier this year. And that was largely influenced by, again, you and I have talked about this, but for your audience, the massive disinformation campaign that the Russians have been engaged in. I think it was a month ago now that there was the indictments from the Department of Justice against the Russian-based payments that were going to American social influencers that were basically spewing all sorts of, like you were saying, like Ukraine can't possibly win. All your money is going
some of my old friends,
corrupt
Doug.
our coal. Yeah. No, 100%. It's been an interesting. Well, I mean, you and I have been on social media for a while fighting those fights.
The gray zone.
Yeah.
The gray zone had its. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just a personal thing. The guys who went after me when I appeared on the Team House have had their names have appeared now in this. Was it State Department? I forget, but as being associated with RT, which was no surprise, but now it's official. And I believe, I don't know for sure, but the gray zone had its charity, what's it called, 501c3 status removed because of its association with the Russians.
Yeah,
I'm saying I believe because I don't know that for sure, and I want to avoid.
Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to go check.
Coming after, yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just say, like, and the insidious nature of those disinformation campaigns is, like there are the more cut and dry cases, like when the DOJ has presented the evidence that says these Russian nationals were providing money through these mechanisms, these financial cutouts that went to these social media influencers that were then going on and talking about how Ukraine was entirely corrupt and like their army was collapsing and everyone, and the Russians were going to conquer the whole country, but But what might be even more insidious than that, I mean, obviously we have to do things about that. We have to be on guard against that. And like you and I have had conversations amongst, with between us and other folks online, is like you have to check your sources, right? Like, it blows my mind, particularly in the social influencing space, folks that like have zero background in defense or security matters. They have zero on the ground insights, but like they're chasing the likes. They're chasing, well, in some cases, like in this DOJ case, they were chasing the money to the tune of, I think one of the guys was getting like $400,000 a week and never stopped to question, like, what's the source of this money and why is somebody whom I apparently don't know willing to pay me this kind of money to say the things I'm saying? But yeah, the more insidious side of that is like the influence it has and how do you map and track that? So I would offer, I don't want to get partisan. I'm a lifelong Republican, but you and I were, and I know a whole bunch of other people were scratching our heads over the recalcitrance, the reluctance to authorize more aid for Ukraine coming from the Republican
right wing
of Congress.
What's
the party
weird
of Reagan, which
you've got the extreme right. I mean, you've got the right and the extreme left converging in common cause.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, there was the extreme left and the extreme right that had, were binding themselves together to oppose aid to Ukraine just when they need it the most. And I would offer that a lot of the challenges that the Ukrainians, as you know, as they had in over probably up until August when there was the Kursk counteroffensive or the offensive into Kursk Oblast in Russia, just absolutely a horrific time particularly in the Ukrainian Eastern Front where we were talking about that 1 to 12 artillery exchange rate, just because like the Ukrainians, their ammo depots are running dry. Obviously the U.S. did eventually kind of, I think that was Churchill who said that Americans will, I'm paraphrasing, will do everything the wrong way until they finally do it the right way. I know that's not the exact quote. And it's true. Like we came through eventually, but how many Ukrainian service members
can always be relied upon to do the right thing after exhausting every other possibility.
That one, yes, yeah. And it's absolutely true. But unfortunately, like that had a real cost. How many Ukrainian service members, how many Ukrainian civilians died because they didn't have Patriot interceptors, they didn't have enough artillery. It is easy for Americans and folks that aren't following this closely or have people on the ground there to lose sight of the fact like these are real lives at play. Disinformation is deadly. I mean, I think that, and real quickly, one of the things, I'm a student of history, military history major from West Point. And one of the things that has been absolutely fascinating to me is when you look at now, like the history that has come out post-Cold War of how the Soviet Union's engaged in active measures, the disinformation campaigns that were designed to influence U.S. audiences. It's incredibly difficult to measure exactly what impact those disinformation operations had, but you know that it had to. So I'll be curious to see in another 20, 30 years from now, when the history of this period is being written and the FSB archives are open, kind of like the KGB archives were opened after the Cold War. Who was on what payroll, who was talking to who was getting run by whom. I think it will be both fascinating and sobering. But like in the here and now, how do we combat that? How do we, as a country, unify with our historical partners and allies, the British, the French, the other members of NATO, to get behind what is very clearly a worthwhile cause that serves all of our interests. So,
Doug, on a positive note, though, wouldn't you agree that kind of our political uncertainty, I suppose, is the kindest thing to say, has awakened countries in Europe, especially Eastern Europe, to really step up to the plate now as far as being long ball hitting members of NATO and great contributors. Poland's a great example, Poland's now like a leading nation, spending 4% of its GDP on defense. And of course, you mentioned the Baltics, everything from building up their military to domestic munition production has stepped up with an eye on the possibility that they will not be able to rely on the United States after the elections.
Yeah, undoubtedly. That has been a huge plus. I mean, it's not lost on anyone that one of Putin's stated objectives in invading Ukraine was to prevent the expansion of NATO any further onto Russia's borders. But in response, he's now got Sweden and Finland, two incredibly powerful countries that have joined NATO and have contributed their military might to the alliance, the defensive alliance. I do think you're absolutely right. We've seen an absolute revitalization of domestic production, of European domestic production of munitions and equipment, and really kind of a recognition that, in particular, as going back to like we were talking about before, with the again, I don't want to get political, but at the end of the day, there was obstructionism in Congress that blocked the aid to Ukraine. You have certain political candidates that are talking about not supporting NATO allies if Article 5 gets invoked, which is a bit mind-boggling to me because, in fact, Article 5 has only been ever invoked once, and it was by the United States, in response to 9/11. So, like, technically, the United States has been the only beneficiary of the NATO Article 5. So, because of that recognition, because of some of that political uncertainty, which I don't think serves America well at all, yes, our NATO allies and really a lot of our allies around the world in other regions, be it Taiwan, Japan is another great example, have I think made the wise decision that perhaps we are not as reliable a partner right now as we used to be, and as such they should pursue their own capabilities. I mean, one of the potential strategic game changers of this whole bringing it full circle what we were talking about before, the introduction of North Korean troops by the Russians into Ukraine may actually convince the South Koreans to open up their massive military industrial complex to provide support to Ukraine, which I think ultimately will be far more beneficial to Ukrainians than a few thousand malnourished, poorly trained, inexperienced North Korean soldiers are going to be for the Russians. But yeah, it's a perfect example. We have seen over the last almost 3 years, since the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, a real revitalization and I say reorientation of a lot of America's partners and allies to be far more self-sufficient, which ultimately I think makes, again, if we're willing to participate sincerely in those alliance structures that the United States had helped build and maintain for last 50 or 60 years, I do think ultimately the United States will benefit greatly, as will the cause of global stability.
So we talked about kind of the micro, and it's good. I'm glad to hear your views on the terrain versus casualty piece. About a month ago, I was really concerned to see that the Russians were within 10 kilometers of Pokrovsk, which is, a shithole town that I've spent too much time, but it is a rail hub, and it's it's kind of a stepping stone to Kramatorsk. But interestingly enough, they haven't moved much since then. And as I said, the Ukrainians gave up Vukovar, which was not a big thing, but they've held on to strategic places like what's it called, Chasiv Yar, the hilltop positions, Touretsk. Yes, it is called Touretsk. We used to joke about that, not Tourette's. So there is certainly a method behind it, and again, it's not a route. But I wanted to, I wanted to ask you, talk to you about something that is quite sensitive on that note, and that is, how is Ukrainian morale? How has that shifted? Are the Ukrainians, we read a lot about Russian desertions, but anecdotally now we're hearing about, Ukraine does have manpower problems, and we're hearing about some morale problems at the front. Do you think these are significant, or do you think that these are a product, again, of disinformation?
So it's never as easy as column A or column B. I will say there certainly what we're seeing some significant morale problems. I mean, many of the units that were originally on the line in February of 2022 have seen almost 100% turnover, if not more, in personnel just from casualties, which you have seen. It's this interesting. I'd say that the Ukrainian army in February 2022 was probably at about a pinnacle because, and I had this conversation with a bunch of folks, and most folks don't realize that actually the U.S. and our NATO partners and allies had been supporting the Ukrainians and helping them reform and revitalize and rearm their military, going all the way back to 2014 when the Russians first annexed and occupied a bunch of territories under the Little Green Men auspices, completely illegally. But anyway, the point being is that in February 2022, the Ukrainian army was actually really, really good. And we saw that performance played out during the Russian invasion. We saw, in particular, well, I'm a bit biased, but like the Ukrainian Special Operations Forces, the Territorial Defense Forces, obviously working with the conventional elements of the Ukrainian military, kind of like chopped up the Russian army as it came in through Belarus. And then, like we were talking about, the liberation of Kharkiv, and then the liberation of the northern flank of Kherson, north of the Dnipro River. I do think that this, with the failure of the counteroffensive in the south in the summer and then of 23, and then really getting back into kind of this grinding World War I style of trench warfare, we have seen fluctuations where, yep, NATO partners and allies are training a ton of Ukrainian forces, cycling them back into the fight. But frankly, the Ukrainian army, I think, is very, very tired. They've made tremendous sacrifices. Right now, there doesn't seem to be an end in sight. So we have seen morale issues. In particular, I'd say running up to, and probably as a secondary effect of that delay that we've been talking about in American military aid, morale, I think, hit a low point at that point when, again, it was like a 1-12 artillery exchange. The aid got delivered. Ukrainians launched a masterful offensive into the Kursk Oblast, into Russia, territory that they still hold and probably will continue to hold at least through the end of the year, if not longer. That was tremendous for Ukrainian morale. Talking to my folks on the ground in Kyiv, they said, it was like complete revitalization. But to your point, there have been problems with desertions. I think the last number I saw was like 85,000 suspected desertions. I just saw a map the other day looking at the number of Ukrainian court martials related to desertion. You see a smattering, few thousand here and there along the front, which is not insignificant. I think, another huge, I guess the last thing I'll say is on that, before I say something else on the disinformation side, is there are challenges on the recruiting side that the Ukrainians are facing. And again, nothing that you don't know. There's both the issue of the diaspora, or the refugee populations, in which you've seen a not insignificant number of Ukrainian military age males flee the country. I just published a piece with IWI last week where I was talking about, some of the incentives the incentives that the Ukrainian government, working by, with, and through some of those countries where the refugee populations exist, could go and pursue some of these military age males that should, frankly, be conscripted. And then similarly, the issues with the minimum age of conscription for the Ukrainian military. Right now, it was just lowered earlier this year from 27 years old to 25 years old. Ukrainians, obviously, they have serious concerns about, like we were talking about before, they need to maintain a certain group of men, a certain sizable population of men to run their military industrial complex, to maintain their population by having more kids. I don't think that, in the United States, our minimum draft age is 18. I don't think the Ukrainians should probably go that low, but they should probably take a look at dropping the age limit again and opening up another couple bands of military age males for conscription. I mean, this is an existential fight for the Ukrainians. Now, on the opposite side of that, I do think the Russians are doing a great job of amplifying those concerns. In particular, over the last couple months, you've probably seen a lot of videos of Ukrainian conscription officials going into the nightclubs and the bars in Western Ukraine to try to round up folks that should be conscripted. And while I'm sure that's happening, I've seen the videos, I've shared the videos. I do know that the Russians are going to great lengths to amplify that. I mean, let's not forget the fact that more Russian military age males fled Russia during the last mobilization, to the tune of a couple million, than were actually conscripted into the Russian army. So, the Russians know that their problems are worse, but they also know that, particularly in Western audiences, amplifying the problems that the Ukrainians are having on their manpower side and their morale side is beneficial to them. So, on the one hand, as defense or security, I won't call us experts, but aficionados, like we have to be sober about our assessments and where we in the United States and our partners and allies are putting resources. But we also have to be very cognizant that war is at the end of the day a very human endeavor, and emotions get involved. And I will say that yes, the Ukrainians have challenge, but the Russians are also really, really, really good. They've got decades and decades going all the way back to the Soviet Union of playing off of those emotions in a way to really achieve their strategic ends when they can't seem to do it on the battlefield.
So, Doug, switching gears here for a sec, staying on Russia, though. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the latest story about the IC has come out and said that they're pretty sure that Russian operatives are behind a recent video. I'm not sure if you saw it, showing supposed ballots being ripped up in Pennsylvania. And I just want to see, I mean, it's near and dear to me because I live in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. I've not seen the video, but I wanted to see if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, no election is perfect, right? Like at the end of the day, we know that's true. I will say, and I know CISA had done a ton of work to try to secure the upcoming election that we have here in like a week. But I will say that it benefits the Russians, and I'm certain the Russians are behind it, or at least part of it. Again, there's this weird mix of there are certainly Americans that benefit from spreading disinformation and undermining faith in the U.S. government and our election process. But I mean, at the end of the day, this is very much an effort supported by the Russian government to sow doubt on our own upcoming elections. You look at again, I hate to be what I've been accused of whataboutism, but it's like in Russia, Vladimir Putin jails and murders and forces his opponents into exile. And nobody believes for a minute that Russian elections are fair. In fact, just this week we saw the election in Georgia, right, where the Georgia Dream Party has claimed victory. Obviously, we've all seen the videos of literal ballot stuffing by folks paid off by the Kremlin. Moldova just had their election 2 weeks ago, where they very narrowly voted to pursue European Union membership. But again, that was right after the Moldovan government broke up. I think it was something on the tune of like $300+ million that the Kremlin had spent trying to buy votes and influence the election to get Moldova to stay out of the European Union. So, but back to your question about Bucks County, Pennsylvania, this is a playbook that the Russians do everywhere. We've seen it. So I think it is naive of Americans to think that they're not doing the exact same thing here, because they have both a vested interest in the outcome of the election, but even if their preferred candidate doesn't win, they also just want to undermine Americans' confidence in our electoral system. Because frankly, then that makes it a whole lot easier for the Russians to say, hey, why are you opposed to our activities around the world? You're just as bad as us. Look at your elections. And that's the danger of social media, right? You can amplify. I don't know if the video is real or not. I've seen it. You can make a video of anything, especially in this day and age with AI. But you amplify it properly and shoot, with Twitter, X, Facebook, and all the other social media platforms, you can buy audiences. Essentially, you can buy amplification of your message. So, it's concerning. I think those of us that play and work in this space all the time, we're very cognizant of it. It is disconcerting the extent to which, the American people and other populations around the world can't, they seem to be incredibly susceptible to it. Now, all to say, Russians are also very good of building in the doubt of the fact checkers into the process. So even when there is evidence presented to the contrary, well, so-and-so on Facebook said that, of course, that's, you were going to lie about that. So I still believe the original thing, even though there's no evidence to support. So anyway, yeah, it's buckle up. It's going to be a crazy, I think, several weeks. I don't think we're going to know the outcome of our election on November 5th. And I do think the seeds have been planted for at least some level of distrust of the outcome and whatever might follow from that.
Yeah, I would think it seems to me that social media has made information operations so much easier. If you're on that end of it, all you have to do is just take a video, make a video, and just drop it. and just, it's like throwing chum in the water. Just watch the show. You don't even have to have really bots anymore, because the
Nope.
average American citizen on one side or the other is going to pick it up and be like, this is exactly what it is. And their echo chamber is going to spin that, and it's just going to keep getting put out and put out and put out. So it's so easy for IO operations to run these days.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, like the interconnected global information space has made information operations infinitely easier. Like well, and we could have a whole nother podcast on how the U.S. kind of falls. Well, I think we're pretty far behind in that capability. Most democratic countries are, because we value, we only speak the truth. We can't influence American population. There's a whole another conversation we had about our challenges in the IO space. The Kremlin doesn't care. The what is that? The Internet Research Institute, or IRA, Internet Research Agency, based out of St. Petersburg. Like, we all know the impacts that they've had on past U.S. elections. I'm sure they're just churning it. And to your point, in our information environment, and as divided of a people as we have become around our politics, which is, again, absolutely mind-boggling to me, because just a couple of decades ago, Americans were Americans, and yeah, you happen to be a Republican, you happen to be a Democrat, but that didn't become like a primary point of our personalities, to the point that now you see through information operations is incredibly exploitable.
Yeah, absolutely. It's become our identity. Instead of hey, what's your sign? It's now what's your politics? Who do you vote for? It's crazy, and it just makes it so much easier to be an IO bad guy. So, but thank you though, appreciate that.
Thank you.
So we talked about the information space, but what about more kinetic operations in Europe, with certainly the European papers, and actually the Economist have been covering the Russian attempts at sabotage. There's the well-publicized ones in Germany, but it seems as though this is a concerted campaign taking place now across Europe. What do we know about that?
Yeah, so going back to the Russians are very, very cognizant of the fact that they cannot compete with Europe militarily in a conventional force-on-force fight. I mean, shoot, they can't even conquer Ukraine, which is not a part of NATO. It's significantly smaller than them. So I think in recognition of that, and in frustration with the continued and in some cases growing support from Europe to Ukraine, the Russians have absolutely pursued a in the shadows covert sabotage campaign that works alongside with and oftentimes in hand with their disinformation campaign. So we've spent a bunch of time talking about IO. Certainly, like I said, we have a whole nother podcast on that. But yeah, we've seen in particular either what's been fascinating is it's either Russian cells themselves, so GRU, FSB, or in many cases working by, with, and through criminal enterprises, which I think was the case in Germany, in Poland, where I know the cases in Poland and Germany, the Russian intelligence services had hired local criminals to do some casing or some close target reconnaissance on potential targets. I think while the evidence isn't concrete yet, I think every indication is there that the Russians were behind the sabotage of the French railway system right around the opening of the Paris Olympics. You'll recall, like the morning of the opening ceremonies, all four main rail lines running into Paris were cut. Well, three were cut, and then one of them, the attack was disrupted, and that was in and around a whole bunch of other chatter. And in fact, I think other Russian nationals that had gotten arrested for suspicion of being plotting against the Paris Olympics. So now, like I was saying, again, don't want to spend a ton of time on it, but like that was also that where you see IO and kinetic operations working in conjunction with each other. Because of course, Russia is super annoyed with France right now for their continuing support to Ukraine. So they were looking at these attacks against the Paris Games as a means to really more like do an IO hit against the French. But at the end of the day, it was actually fairly successful. Like I said, 3 of the 4 major lines into Paris were cut, which caused all sorts of disruptions for the opening ceremonies, and of course some level of embarrassment for the French. The extent to which, and this is where when you look historically at the Russians, they also tend to be very, very ham-fisted with these sorts of kinetic attacks and these, even their information operations, where like they're so blatant. Um, my fear is always when you start looking at things like these kinetic attacks, and I think France would have been a perfect example. There was the one Russian national that got rolled up on the train into France who had gotten drunk, who was telling everyone that he was an FSB officer there to
Are you
like
kidding
poison
me?
people,
Yeah.
right? And so like that, maybe that was like the obvious, hey, I'm the rabbit, chase me, chase me. Meanwhile, some other teams were doing the hits on the rail line. And I think what gets lost in the discussion is, and my fear is that like the Russians do appear very ham-fisted on some of these things, like very, very blatant. The ballot stuffing in Georgia, where you have like videos of Russian dudes shoving ballots into boxes, and but if you do the blatant stuff, then you might miss the more clandestine activities. And that is a danger. Like the United States, I know that there is a constant fear, particularly. And again, this is where, unfortunately, the way we make certain topics very, very partisan, that it prevents us from getting a good solution. So, like the southern border, perfect example. There's a very real fear that Russian or Chinese operatives could be moving freely in and out of the country through the southern border, allowing them to do surveillance on and set the conditions for potential attacks on critical U.S. infrastructure. Now, I think at the end of the day, probably the majority of those operatives are coming in via, commercial airlines. But regardless, that's something where there's a very real threat. We've seen it played out in Europe. We've seen it played out other places around the world. And because we made the issue so partisan, like we had a border bill get shot down that would have, for all of its many failures, still would have provided a ton of money, resources, and more personnel to border patrol. So, at the end of the day, the Russians, they do this. We know they do it. They've got a history of doing it. I mean, you look at the Skripal poisoning in the UK. Andy, I'm sure you remember that. That was like, what, 2009?
That's my hometown,
late
Salisbury.
Yeah. Salisbury, the Skripal poisoning. I know the Russians are trying to get back their hitman that killed the Chechen in Germany a few years back. They're trying to do a prisoner exchange for him. So like none of this is new. The Russians do this. They're not particularly good at it. So you'll remember from the UK experience, like, sure, the guys got out of the country, but like when they pulled that whole attempted assassination apart, like they had video, they had the real names, like Bellingcat. I know they did a great expose on that hit, where it's like there's the videos,
they threw it in the
identities.
trash. They threw the Novichok in a dumpster after using it.
Yeah. So anyway, like this is a part of the landscape. I do think I did a piece in Center for European Policy Analysis probably a month ago now about fighting back against the Russians in the shadows, and I do think that this is an arena in which we cede the initiative to the Russians far too much. At the point at which the Russians clearly engage in illegal activity and do so oftentimes in such an overt fashion, like there, in my opinion, there should be more steps taken, both safeguard against it, but also punish it.
Now, in our discussions before we went live, you mentioned Russian involvement in Yemen, and so I can't let you go without expanding on that.
Yes. So Western intelligence services have come forward and said, yep, we have all the evidence to support the argument that the Russian government has been providing some form of intelligence support to Ansar al-Allah, which is the Houthi majority rebel group that actually controls a lot of northern Yemen. So yeah, going back several months, starting actually, let's see, there was the October 7th. Actually, we've just passed the year mark, I just realized. But yeah, the October 7th attack by Hamas in Israel, and then Israel's response into Gaza. In response to that Israeli counteroffensive or invasion into Gaza, the Houthis, who are, like I said, Houthi majority, Shia religious affiliated group with deep and longstanding ties to Iran, undertook a anti-shipping campaign in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, right around that Bab el-Mandeb Strait. And largely the Houthis have been fairly indiscriminate in their attacks. They have a whole array of anti-ship ballistic missiles and cruise missiles and unmanned surface vessels. Most of the designs they received from the Iranians, though they have also developed a ton of indigenous production capability using the plans off of those provided systems. What the Yemenis didn't have until relatively recently was good targeting data. So if you look at the ships that had been hit, they were generally fairly random. In fact, they even managed to hit, I think, a couple of Chinese and Russian-owned vessels, which of course wasn't really acceptable to the Russians or the Chinese, who were aligned, I'll say, with Iran. And you actually saw some steps. I did a piece about this probably about 6 months ago. NATO in the crosshairs, also at Center for European Policy Analysis, where we talked about the actual agreements that it appeared that the Chinese and Russian governments had arrived at with the Houthis via Iran to not target their vessels. But anyway, but for what it was worth, the Houthis were having a ton of difficulty because while they could identify and shoot at ships in the Red Sea and in the Gulf of Aden, they couldn't really necessarily know who owned the vessels. Anyways, in the last week, there was the reports released that, in fact, the Yemeni or the Houthis had been providing or had been receiving some intelligence via the Russians that was helping them refine their targeting data. If nothing else, and the argument I made in that piece about 6 months ago is that the Houthi operations against shipping in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden directly support or indirectly supports really that authoritarian pact or that authoritarian group of Russia, Iran, China, in that you look at the massive amount of U.S. assets that were being committed to that region. I was still over at the Department of the Navy when the Houthi anti-shipping campaign started, and we were watching very, very carefully at the number of U.S. Navy ships, Coast Guard vessels, and really the munition bunkers on those ships as they were expending the surface-to-air missiles to shoot down all of these Houthi cruise missiles and drones and the anti-ship cruise missiles. So, I mean, that has a very real cost on us, right? So it makes sense when you start talking about strategic competition and irregular warfare as a military component of strategic competition for the Iranians and the Russians to provide some form of support to the Houthis because their activities in that region take away our ability to respond elsewhere around the world. And I guess for what it's worth noting, and I had forgotten about this, I know Vladimir Putin had made a statement kind of as an aside in one of his interviews about 2 months ago, where he was talking about, hey, maybe Russia is going to start providing missiles directly to the Houthis, drawing a clear comparison to the support that the United States is giving to Ukraine. I mean, obviously, I think there's a distinct difference because nobody recognizes the Houthis as the legitimate government of Yemen. There's, in fact, a Republic of Yemen government. But anyway, just to like contextualize and put what's going on in Yemen in the broader irregular warfare strategic competition conversation.
Now we talked about, and this, I know we're coming to an end, but we talked about what North Korea and Iran are doing for Russia. What are your biggest concerns about Russia, what Russia can do for those two countries in particular in return?
Yeah, so the reports that I've been seeing, open source, would suggest that the Russian government, in return for the soldiers and the artillery and the ammunition and the other equipment that the North Koreans are providing, are then in return providing the North Koreans with nuclear technology or nuclear weapon technology. So, yes, the North Koreans have a handful, somewhere, I think, between like 5 or 10, maybe a few more, very rudimentary nuclear warheads, right? But what they lack are really reliable means to deliver them. They do have a small family of ballistic missiles, nothing that would approach what the United States or our partners and allies possess. But at the end of the day, Kim knows that his regime's survival is based upon the ability to deter any sort of external attack. And really the only effective means that I think he has to do that is via nuclear weapons. So what we've seen is that reports that the Russians are providing, maybe not like just straight up, hey, here's a missile system that you can put your warhead on, but at least providing some of that technical know-how back to the North Koreans so they can improve their own systems. We know for a fact that that's been happening in Ukraine, where North Korean technicians have come along with the North Korean ballistic missiles that they've been providing to the Russians to observe their use in an actual war, which then allows them to gather all the data, send it back to North Korea, and use even that just to refine the capabilities of their system. So I do think my fears, specifically when you look at the Korean Peninsula, is that the technical know-how coming back to North Korea will allow them to advance by leaps and bounds. I think we'll probably see a very similar threat with Iran. Everyone is very aware that the Iranians provided the Shahed 136s and some of the other subsequent generations of the one-way attack drones to the Russians. In fact, there's entire production facilities now set up in Russia using Iranian tooling to produce Shaheds. I am certain that in return, the Iranians are going to get some very, very important know-how on how to improve their own, in particular, I'd say the ballistic missile systems. I think what we've seen around with the tit for tat back and forth between the Israelis and the Iranians over the last month is that the Iranians recognize that their ballistic missile systems are wildly inadequate. I mean, you'll recall at the beginning of beginning of this month, the Iranians shot some 300 ballistic missiles at Israel. And I don't know, I think maybe there was like one casualty that was actually a Palestinian. In return, the Israelis just like obliterated a bunch of Iranian targets using their Air Force. So I do think one of the things that the Iranians will be looking for and will probably receive back from the Russians will be improvements to their ballistic missile program, which combined with the fact that we think they're few weeks to a month out from breakout on developing a nuclear warhead, which of course would then take more time to marry to a missile system, does, I think, set the conditions for the Iranians to benefit greatly from this relationship with Russia.
Doug, we have, I know we haven't exhausted all topics, but we've come to the end of your time. So thank you so much. Dee, over to you. I just want to say that we absolutely want to bring Doug back on again.
Yes.
Yeah, 100%, Doug. That was incredible. Everything, all the links to find Doug will be in the description, as well as Andy's book, When the Tempest Gathers. Don't forget to subscribe to our new YouTube channel, Eyes On. The link, everything you need to know is in the description. And of course, the best way to support the show is patreon.com/theteamhouse. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug.
Yeah, thanks much. All the best, everyone.